August 1st, 1943, low over the Ploesti oil refineries of Romania. Lieutenant Colonel Addison Baker's B-24 Liberator is burning, hit hard by flak during one of the lowest, most dangerous bombing runs American airmen would fly in the entire war. Rather than gain altitude and let his crew bail out, Baker holds the aircraft steady and flies it directly into the target, delivering his bombs before the Liberator finally goes down. He and his co-pilot, Major John Jerstad, are killed. Both are awarded the Medal of Honor. Before the day is over, 3 more men flying B-24s over Ploesti will earn the same award, one of only a handful of missions in American military history to produce 5 Medals of Honor in a single day. Ploesti still stands today as the record holder for the most Medals of Honor awarded for a single air action in American military history. Only the month-long battle for Iwo Jima, an extended ground and amphibious campaign rather than a single mission, produced more Medals of Honor across its entire duration, 27 in all, a comparison that puts Ploesti's single afternoon in genuinely rare company. Pause on that. The aircraft that carried these men into Ploesti was, by production numbers alone, the most built American military aircraft of the entire Second World War, more than 18,000 of them rolling off assembly lines by the war's end. It was also an aircraft its own crews nicknamed the Flying Coffin, a grim label earned honestly through a design that traded crew survivability for range and bomb load in ways that became painfully clear the moment anything went wrong in the air. This is the story of the Consolidated B-24 Liberator, the industrial achievement that built it, the design compromises that shaped its grim reputation among the men who flew it, and the raid over Romania that remains its single most costly and most decorated day of the war. Part 1. The B-24's defining engineering feature was its wing, designed by David R. Davis and licensed by Consolidated Aircraft, a thin, high-aspect ratio airfoil that generated unusually efficient lift at cruise speed, giving the Liberator meaningfully better range and a higher bomb load than the B-17 Flying Fortress it flew alongside throughout the war. That efficiency came at a structural cost. The Davis wing's thinner profile left less margin for battle damage than the B-17's thicker, more conventional wing, and Liberator crews and mechanics alike came to understand that a handful of well-placed cannon rounds through a wing spar could bring the aircraft down in a way a B-17 might have survived. The same wing shape also gave the B-24 markedly worse low-speed handling characteristics, a serious liability for a bomber that needed to fly tight, stable formations at reduced speed for extended stretches over target areas thick with flak and fighters. The Liberator's fuselage design compounded the problem in ways that had nothing to do with the wing at all. Its twin bomb bays were separated by a narrow catwalk, barely wide enough for a crew member to cross while wearing full flight gear, and the fuel tanks feeding its 4 engines were distributed through cells built directly into the wing structure itself, placing a meaningful share of the aircraft's fuel supply in exactly the section of the airframe most vulnerable to the kind of battle damage that could turn a hit into a fire within seconds. Part 2. Getting more than 18,000 Liberators built at all required one of the more remarkable industrial efforts of the American war economy. Henry Ford's purpose-built Willow Run plant in Michigan, constructed specifically for the task, eventually reached a production rate of 1 completed B-24 every hour along a mile-long assembly line, using mass production techniques borrowed directly from the automobile industry to manufacture an aircraft far more complex than any car Ford had ever built. The plant itself required an enormous new workforce, drawn substantially from women and workers relocating from across the country, part of the broader wartime transformation of American industrial labor. And the logistical challenge of coordinating parts, subassemblies, and a mile-long moving line building an aircraft with more than 1 million individual parts was, in its own right, treated by contemporary observers as comparable in complexity to the aircraft's own combat mission. By 1945, Willow Run alone accounted for roughly 70% of all Liberator production nationwide, even as 2 additional plants, at Consolidated's own facilities and at Douglas and North American under license, continued turning out the type as well. Standardizing production across so many separate plants, each building the same aircraft under license, with its own regional workforce and supply chains, introduced its own quiet complications. Minor variations between airframes built at different facilities occasionally required field modifications once aircraft reached operational squadrons, a common but rarely discussed friction point in any wartime aircraft program built at this kind of scale across multiple manufacturers simultaneously.
The sheer scale of that production is a large part of why the B-24 ended up flying in every theater of the war, from long-range Atlantic anti-submarine patrols to the Pacific island-hopping campaign to the strategic bombing of Germany and its occupied territories. Part 3. The nickname Flying Coffin came directly from the men who flew it, and it was rooted in specific, well-understood hazards rather than simple superstition. The aircraft's high-mounted wing and the shape of its fuselage made it notoriously unforgiving to ditch in open water. Unlike some other bombers, a B-24 forced down at sea tended to break apart on impact or flood rapidly, trapping crew members who might otherwise have had time to escape a more gently settling aircraft. Escape routes inside the fuselage were narrow, and in an emergency, effectively bottlenecked through a limited number of usable exits. A serious problem for a 10-man crew trying to bail out of a damaged, possibly spinning aircraft in the span of only a minute or two. Combined with the wing's vulnerability to structural failure under battle damage, the nickname reflected a specific, reasoned assessment by the crews who flew it. If a Liberator went down hard, the odds of getting everyone out alive were meaningfully worse than in the B-17 flying in the same formation. It is worth noting that Flying Coffin was not a uniquely applied label. American service members attached similarly grim nicknames to several other aircraft types across the war, including gliders used in airborne assaults, whenever a design's specific vulnerabilities became well known within the units that flew or rode in them. What made the Liberator's version of that nickname distinctive was less its originality than how widely and consistently it circulated among heavy bomber crews specifically, a sign that the underlying concern was broadly shared rather than confined to one unfortunate unit's bad experience. Part 4. None of that stopped the Liberator from becoming an essential weapon, precisely because of the range and payload its efficient wing provided. Its longer legs made it the preferred aircraft for maritime patrol against German U-boats in the Atlantic, where very long-range Liberator squadrons operating out of Newfoundland, Iceland, and Northern Ireland finally closed the mid-Atlantic gap that German submarines had previously used as a haven beyond the reach of Allied air cover. In the Pacific, that same range let Liberators strike targets at distances the shorter-legged B-17 simply could not reach. And by 1943, the type had become the primary heavy bomber for several Army Air Forces units across both the European and Pacific theaters, flying alongside, and in some units eventually replacing, the Flying Fortress entirely. Liberator squadrons operating out of Britain also flew as part of the broader, combined bomber offensive against German industry, often on missions requiring the extra range the type's wing provided to reach targets in eastern Germany, Austria, and the Balkans that were simply beyond a B-17's comfortable operating radius. Missions that included the Ploesti raid this story centers on, and later, larger-scale strikes against the same refinery complex, once American commanders concluded that a single raid, however costly, had not permanently ended Ploesti's contribution to the German war economy. Part 5. Nowhere did the Liberator's specific strengths and vulnerabilities collide more violently than over Ploesti, Romania, home to refineries that supplied close to a third of Nazi Germany's high-octane aviation fuel. On August 1, 1943, an operation codenamed Tidal Wave sent 177 B-24s on an extraordinarily low-level attack, flying at treetop height across hundreds of miles of enemy territory, specifically to achieve surprise and improve bombing accuracy against a heavily defended target, a tactic that traded altitude and the safety it normally provided for precision and the element of surprise. Crews had trained for the low-level approach for weeks beforehand at a specially constructed practice range in the Libyan desert, built to roughly mimic the target's layout, since planners understood that flying an aircraft the size of a B-24 at treetop height in close formation demanded a level of precision flying that had almost no precedent in American heavy bomber doctrine up to that point in the war. The plan depended on tight timing and precise navigation across a long overwater and overland route.
When the lead formation made a wrong turn partway to the target, heading toward Bucharest instead of Ploesti, the rest of the strike force was forced to break radio silence to redirect it, costing the mission the surprise its entire low-level approach had been designed to achieve. German and Romanian defenders, already on a heightened state of alert from earlier intelligence warnings about a possible attack on the refineries, used the extra warning time created by that broken radio silence to bring additional anti-aircraft guns and fighter squadrons into position before the American bombers ever arrived over the target itself, converting what had been designed as a surprise strike into a fight against a defense that had several extra minutes to prepare. Part 6. What followed was some of the most intense anti-aircraft fire American bomber crews faced anywhere in the war, delivered at an altitude that gave gunners on the ground a nearly point-blank shot at aircraft that had almost no room to maneuver. Lieutenant Colonel Addison Baker and Major John Jerstad, leading the 93rd Bombardment Group, held their burning Liberator on course to strike its assigned target rather than pull up and abandon the run, a decision that cost both men their lives and earned each a posthumous Medal of Honor. Lieutenant Lloyd Herbert Hughes, flying a B-24 critically damaged and trailing fuel, continued his bomb run through the target rather than divert, and was killed when his aircraft went down. He too received the Medal of Honor posthumously. Colonel John Kane and Colonel Leon Johnson, each leading a separate bombing group to its target through the same withering fire, survived the mission and became the only two of the 5 Ploesti Medal of Honor recipients to live to receive the award in person. Kane, whose reputation for hard-driving discipline had already earned him the nickname Killer among his own men before the raid, pressed his formation through smoke, flames, and debris thrown up by bombs from aircraft that had attacked just seconds ahead of his own, refusing to break formation despite conditions that made visual navigation over the target nearly impossible. Johnson's group, arriving from a different approach angle, faced a similarly saturated wall of flak and fighter opposition, and still managed to deliver an effective strike, a performance that later analysts credited with inflicting a meaningful share of the total damage the raid achieved. Part 7. The cost of Operation Tidal Wave was severe by any measure. Of the aircraft that reached the target area, 43 were shot down outright. Another 56 returned with serious battle damage, and 8 more were forced to land in neutral Turkey, where their crews were interned for the remainder of their involvement in the war. Only 99 of the aircraft that had set out made it back to their own bases, with a further 15 landing safely at other Allied airfields. Casualty figures for the raid vary somewhat between sources, a common pattern in accounts of large, chaotic missions, where record-keeping in the immediate aftermath was necessarily incomplete. Total aircraft losses are cited in different histories as somewhere between 43 and 54, and total American airmen killed, captured, or missing are put at figures ranging from roughly 430 to just over 500, depending on whether a given account counts only those killed outright or includes the wounded, captured, and interned as well. By any of these counts, it remains one of the costliest single missions of the American Air War. The refineries at Ploesti suffered real damage, but repair crews restored much of the lost production capacity within weeks, a sobering outcome that left many participants and later historians questioning whether the mission's cost had been proportionate to its results. Post-war assessments of the raid's actual impact on German fuel supplies have varied considerably, with some analysts crediting Tidal Wave with meaningfully disrupting output for a period of weeks to months, and others arguing the refinery's rapid repair meant the strategic effect was considerably smaller than the mission's cost in aircraft and crews would suggest, a genuinely contested question that has never been fully settled among historians studying the wartime Axis fuel economy. Part 8. It would be a mistake to let the Flying Coffin nickname, however honestly earned, stand as the final word on the Liberator's reputation among the men who actually flew it. Plenty of Liberator veterans pushed back against the idea that their aircraft was simply a death trap compared to the more celebrated B-17, pointing out that the type's range and bomb load let it strike targets and patrol distances no flying fortress could match, and that its reputation for structural fragility, while real, reflected a specific vulnerability to a specific kind of hit rather than a blanket unworthiness for combat. The honest picture is one of trade-offs rather than simple inferiority,
A bomber built around an unusually efficient wing gained meaningful range and payload at the cost of exactly the kind of structural and evacuation margin that mattered most on the worst days. And Ploesti was, in nearly every sense, the worst day the aircraft and its crews ever faced together.
It is also worth noting that the low-level tactics used at Ploesti were not typical of how the B-24 spent most of its wartime service. The overwhelming majority of Liberator combat missions were flown at conventional medium to high altitude, where the type's structural vulnerabilities, while real, did not confront crews with the same combination of point-blank ground fire and near-zero margin for evasive maneuvering that made Tidal Wave uniquely brutal. Judging the entire aircraft's combat record by its single worst mission risks the same kind of distortion this channel tries to correct in every episode. A dramatic, well-documented outlier standing in for a much longer, more ordinary service history that, for most Liberator crews on most missions, looked considerably less harrowing than the raid that produced 5 Medals of Honor in a single afternoon. The B-24's wartime service did not end with Ploesti.
Liberators continued flying strategic bombing missions over Germany, anti-submarine patrols across the Atlantic, and long-range strikes across the Pacific for the rest of the war, ultimately dropping a larger total tonnage of bombs than any other American aircraft type. Despite that record, and despite outnumbering the B-17 in total production, the Liberator has never quite matched the Flying Fortress's place in American popular memory, a gap historians and veterans alike have long attributed partly to the B-17's more photogenic silhouette and partly to the simple fact that the Liberator's own reputation, forged in no small part by its own crew's unsentimental nickname for it, was never built for admiration in the first place.
Surviving Liberator veterans organizations and museum groups have spent decades since the war working specifically to correct that imbalance, arguing that an aircraft which dropped a greater total bomb tonnage than any other American type, patrolled more ocean against U-boats than any other long-range aircraft the Allies fielded, and carried crews through missions like Ploesti, deserves a place in public memory closer to the B-17s than the comparatively modest recognition it has generally received. It was built and flown because it could carry more, farther than almost anything else America had. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, because there are more of these. More aircraft whose own crews, not their enemies, gave them the nicknames that stuck, and more honest looks at what those names actually reveal about the trade-offs built into every machine that ever went to war.